He was just a poor watchmaker. That was what Richard Hamilton had told himself for 2 years. 2 years of cold dinners, clipped silences, and barely disguised contempt directed at the woman his son had chosen to love. Richard Hamilton, 68 years old, chairman of Hamilton Global Enterprises, a man who had turned his grandfather's modest textile import business into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate spanning finance, real estate, and private infrastructure, had reduced the father of his daughter-in-law to a single sentence: a poor watchmaker in a forgotten suburb, a man of no consequence, a man who did not belong anywhere near the Hamilton name. And on the night of his company's 40th anniversary gala, a gilded evening attended by senators, hedge fund managers, technology executives, and the most powerful names in American commerce, Richard had decided, finally, that enough was enough. He would end the marriage. He would reclaim the bloodline. He would restore what he believed was the natural order of things. What he did not know, what he could not have imagined in 40 years of building his empire, was that the man he had dismissed so casually was the single human being on earth with the power to bring everything Richard Hamilton had ever built crashing down with nothing more than a signature. Richard Hamilton had not always been cruel. There were people who remembered a younger version of him, a driven 30-year-old in a second-hand suit, cold-calling investors from a rented office in downtown Chicago, eating sandwiches at his desk, sleeping on a fold-out cot when the deals ran long. Those people, the few who were still around, would tell you that ambition had done something to Richard over the decades. It had calcified him. It had replaced the hunger of a young man trying to prove himself with the arrogance of an old man who had forgotten he ever needed to. By the time his only son, Ethan, was born, Richard had already started to believe that the world was divided into two kinds of people: those who belonged at the table and those who cleared it. He had spent the better part of 4 decades ensuring that every person in his life fell clearly into the first category. His wife, Margaret, came from a Boston family with old money and older manners. His business partners were all men and women of pedigree. His club memberships, his charity board seats, his vacation homes, every single element of Richard Hamilton's life had been curated to signal one thing above all else: that he had arrived and that he intended to stay. Ethan Hamilton had grown up watching his father perform this curation with a kind of exhausting precision, and somewhere along the way had quietly decided he wanted nothing to do with it. He was brilliant. Richard could not deny that graduating top of his class from Georgetown Law, turning down a partnership track at one of the most prestigious firms in New York to take a lower-paying position at a nonprofit legal defense organization that helped wrongfully convicted prisoners. Richard had never quite forgiven him for that decision. It was, in Richard's view, a waste of a perfectly good pedigree. But Ethan had not asked for his father's forgiveness, and he had not asked for his blessing 2 years ago when he came home one Sunday afternoon and introduced Maya Johnson as the woman he intended to marry. Maya was 31 years old, poised, quietly brilliant, and black. She held a master's degree in public policy from the University of Michigan and served as Director of Strategic Development at a national nonprofit focused on education equity in underserved communities. She had warm eyes and a composed stillness about her, the kind of stillness that comes not from passivity, but from a person who has learned that not every battle needs to be fought out loud. Richard had looked at her across the dining room table that first Sunday and had known, with the absolute certainty of a man who had spent decades trusting his instincts, that he did not approve. He never said the word. To his credit, or perhaps to his cowardice, Richard Hamilton never once made his objection explicit. He did not speak about race. He spoke instead about compatibility, about foundations, about the difficulty of building a life with someone whose background was so fundamentally different from your own. He spoke about the Hamilton legacy, about what it meant to carry a name that had been built over generations, about the responsibility that came with that inheritance. He used phrases like "not quite the same world and different frame of reference" and, most frequently, "not the right fit for this family." Every time Ethan pushed back, and Ethan pushed back often, his jaw tight, his voice carefully controlled, Richard would pivot, redirect, reframe. He was a skilled negotiator. He had spent 4 decades learning how to say no without ever quite saying it. But Maya knew. Maya had always known. She was too intelligent not to, and she was too dignified to pretend otherwise. What struck everyone who watched their interactions closely was that Maya never took the bait. At family dinners, when Richard's sister-in-law made pointed remarks about the neighborhood Maya had grown up in, Maya smiled pleasantly and changed the subject. When Richard asked, for the 4th time in as many months, what her father did for a living, Maya answered the same way she always did, calmly, without elaboration, without apology. Her father lived simply, she said. He was a private man. He valued his quiet life. Richard always received this answer with a thin smile and a small dismissive nod, as though the information confirmed exactly what he had already suspected. He had even hired a private investigator at one point, a detail he never shared with Ethan, and the report had come back precisely as expected. Samuel Johnson, 64 years old, occupation listed as watchmaker and small repair shop owner. Home address: a modest 2-bedroom house in a residential suburb outside of Detroit. Vehicle: a late model pickup truck with a dented rear bumper. No social media presence. No business filings beyond the small shop. No property beyond the house. Richard had read the report twice, set it on his desk, and felt the deep, settled satisfaction of a man whose prejudices have been confirmed by evidence. What the investigator had not found, what no ordinary search would have found, was anything about the man Samuel Johnson had been for 30 years before he closed the door on the world and walked away from it. The cruelty escalated slowly, the way most cruelty does, in increments small enough that each individual act could be dismissed, but large enough that the cumulative weight became almost unbearable. At the Hamilton family's 4th of July gathering at their estate in Lake Geneva, one of Richard's older relatives had leaned across the table toward Maya with the bright, weaponized smile of someone who believes their money protects them from accountability, and asked, in a voice loud enough for the entire table to hear, whether her father was still fixing watches in that little shop on the east side. The laughter that followed was not loud, but it was the quiet, knowing laughter of a group of wealthy people who have just shared a private joke at someone else's expense. Maya had said yes. Her father was still in his shop, and she was very proud of him. The table had moved on. Later that night, back in their bedroom at the estate, Ethan had sat on the edge of the bed with his face in his hands and apologized until Maya made him stop. She sat down beside him and took his hands in hers and told him something that he would remember for the rest of his life. She told him that she had never once been ashamed of her father, not as a child when other kids had bigger houses and fancier vacations, not in college when her classmates had parents who showed up in luxury cars and wrote large checks to the alumni fund, not now, in this house full of people who thought the size of a man's bank account determined the size of his worth. Her father had taught her one thing above everything else. She said that the way you treat people when you have nothing to prove is the truest measure of who you are. She said this quietly, without heat, without tears, and then she said she was ready for bed. Ethan held her for a long time before either of them slept. But even love has its limits of endurance. In the months that followed, Richard's pressure on Ethan intensified. He stopped being subtle. Over lunch at his private club on a Tuesday in March, with the city spread out silver and gray below them through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Richard laid out his terms with the practiced precision of a man presenting a business proposal. Ethan would dissolve the marriage. In exchange, Richard would formally transfer operational control of Hamilton Global, to him full executive authority, majority voting rights on the board, the kind of inheritance that most sons in their position would have spent their careers maneuvering toward. Richard spoke for nearly 20 minutes. He used phrases like, the future of everything we've built, and what this family means, and your obligation to something larger than yourself. When he finished, he straightened his tie and looked at his son across the white tablecloth with the calm expression of a man who believes the negotiation is essentially complete. Ethan set down his fork. He looked at his father for a long moment, long enough that the silence became uncomfortable, even for Richard, who was not a man who was often made uncomfortable. Then Ethan said, quietly and clearly, that he was going home to his wife. He left before the dessert menus arrived. Richard sat alone at the table for 40 minutes, staring at his mineral water, and for the first time in recent memory, he was genuinely uncertain about what to do next. That uncertainty curdled quickly into anger. He told Margaret that evening that Ethan had made his choice and would have to live with the consequences. Margaret, who had been watching her husband's obsession with this matter with increasing unease, said nothing. She had learned over 43 years of marriage that certain arguments were not worth the cost of having them. It was Margaret who had quietly suggested, months earlier, that Richard consider dropping the matter entirely. She had met Samuel Johnson only once, briefly, at the wedding, a small outdoor ceremony that Richard had attended in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and a smile that reached approximately his lower jaw. Samuel had shaken Richard's hand, with the unhurried ease of a man who has no interest in impressing anyone, said a few warm words about Ethan, and spent the rest of the reception talking with Ethan's law school friends and laughing at something one of the caterers had said. Richard had watched him from across the garden and thought, exactly what I expected. A man, entirely out of his depth. A man who had no idea where he was. What Richard had failed to notice, because he had not been looking for it, was that two of the guests at that wedding, both of whom Richard knew as significant players in the infrastructure investment space, had greeted Samuel Johnson with the particular warmth reserved for people you genuinely respect, not people you are being polite to. Samuel Johnson had spent most of his adult life being very careful about what the world could see. He had grown up in Detroit, the son of a mechanic and a schoolteacher, both of whom had impressed upon him from an early age that the quality of your character was the only currency that could not be inflated or devalued. He had been extraordinarily gifted with numbers, the kind of intuitive, almost physical relationship with financial structures that cannot be taught in any classroom. And by his mid-20s, he had turned a small inheritance from his grandfather into a series of investments that made his early employers blink. By 35, he had co-founded what would become one of the most influential private investment vehicles in the country, a fund called Blackstone Crest, operating in near-total anonymity at a time when the financial industry was beginning its love affair with personal branding and media visibility. Samuel had never been interested in visibility. He had been interested in outcomes. The fund took positions in banking, in clean energy infrastructure, in telecommunications, in emerging market technology, always quietly, always patiently, always with the long view that most investors abandoned the moment the quarterly reports came in soft. He had made and lost and remade fortunes several times over, and at 64, his actual net worth, the kind that showed up in carefully structured holding companies and blind trusts across 6 jurisdictions, was a number that would have made Richard Hamilton's eyes water. But none of that was what defined Samuel Johnson to the people who knew him. What defined him was the Tuesday afternoons he spent at his small shop on Delaney Street, repairing watches for the neighborhood because he genuinely enjoyed it. What defined him was the fact that when his daughter called him on Sunday evenings, his first question was never about money or status or the weight of the world she was navigating. His first question was always the same. He would ask her if she was happy, and when she said yes, he would say that was enough. He meant it every single time. The 40th anniversary gala for Hamilton Global was held on a Saturday evening in October at the Marquette Grand, the largest and most prestigious event venue in Chicago, a building whose renovation Richard had personally overseen 3 years earlier when Hamilton Global had acquired it as part of a real estate portfolio expansion. The invitation list ran to over 800 names, and the ones that mattered: the senators, the Federal Reserve Board members, the heads of 3 Fortune 100 companies, the private equity titans, and the old money families who moved markets with their mood, had all confirmed their attendance months in advance. Richard had spent weeks on the speech. He wanted it to be the definitive statement of what Hamilton Global represented, not just as a company but as a standard, a proof of concept for what American enterprise could be when it was built on the right foundations by the right people. He had also, in the weeks leading up to the event, been refining a secondary purpose for the evening. He had decided that the gala would serve as the moment he drew a public line. He would not be crude about it. He would not make a scene. But in front of every significant person in his professional and social world, he would make clear through the architecture of the evening, through the questions he asked, through the particular way in which he would invite Maya's father onto the stage, and let the contrast speak for itself, that the Hamilton family had standards, and that those standards mattered. He had shared none of this with Ethan, who had agreed to attend the gala only because Maya had asked him to, believing that a public confrontation was something Richard would never risk in front of his most important clients and allies. Maya had called her father 2 weeks before the event and asked, quietly, whether he would be willing to come. Samuel had been silent for a moment, the particular silence of a man considering the full weight of a question, and then he had said yes. He had not asked for details. He had not asked what would be expected of him. He trusted his daughter. He had always trusted his daughter. The evening of the gala, he drove himself to Chicago in his pickup truck, checked into a mid-range hotel 6 blocks from the Marquette Grand, hung up his good suit, and went to sleep at 9:30. The event was, by any objective measure, spectacular. The Marquette Grand's main ballroom had been transformed with a precision that spoke to enormous budgets and obsessive planning. 800 white orchid centerpieces, custom lighting that shifted through 3 color temperatures over the course of the evening, a chamber orchestra playing in the East Alcove during cocktail hour, and a display of Hamilton Global's 40-year timeline projected across an entire wall in a visual presentation that had taken a production team 3 months to assemble. Richard moved through the room with the ease of a man entirely at home, receiving congratulations with the practiced grace of someone who has been congratulated at this level for a very long time. He shook hands with a senator from Illinois, exchanged brief words with the CEO of one of the country's largest private infrastructure funds, spent 12 minutes with a former Treasury official who had recently joined a Hamilton Global Advisory Board. He was at his absolute best in these rooms. This was his element, and he knew it. Ethan and Maya arrived together. Maya wore a deep burgundy dress, simple and elegant, her hair natural, her only jewelry, a pair of small gold earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. She moved through the room with the same quiet composure she brought to everything, greeting people warmly, engaging genuinely, never performing. Ethan stayed close to her, his hand at the small of her back, the slight tension around his jaw, the only visible sign that he was aware this evening carried weight. Richard acknowledged them from across the room with a nod. His expression was pleasant. He was waiting. Midway through the dinner service, after the toasts had been delivered and the main course had been cleared, Richard rose to give his keynote address. It was, for the first 10 minutes, exactly the speech he had written, a sweeping, polished account of Hamilton Global's history, its values, its vision for the next 4 decades. He spoke about legacy. He spoke about what it meant to build something that would outlast you. He spoke about the importance of standards, of knowing who you are and where you come from, of understanding that the foundations you choose determine everything that comes after. He spoke with the conviction of a man who has never seriously questioned whether his perspective might be incomplete. Then he paused, set his notes on the podium, and looked out at the room. He said he wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the people who had shaped not just the company, but the family behind it. He said that family was, in the end, the most important thing, the thing all the money was really for. He said he wanted to invite someone special to join them on the stage, someone whose presence this evening was a reminder of where Hamilton Global's next generation was coming from. He looked directly at Maya as he said this. His smile did not waver. He asked if Samuel Johnson was in the room. Maya held her husband's hand under the table. She did not look alarmed. She looked, if anything, utterly calm, the stillness of someone who knows something that the room does not. From the back of the ballroom, a man stood up. He was not tall in any imposing way, and his suit was good, but not notable, a well-cut charcoal gray that a practiced eye might have identified as expensive, but that carried none of the deliberate signaling of the other suits in the room. He wore a watch on his left wrist, a vintage piece with a worn leather strap, the kind of watch that a watchmaker might choose for himself, not because it was valuable, but because it was honest. He made his way through the tables without hurry, without ceremony, without the self-conscious performance of a man unused to attention. He simply walked, as a person walks when they are entirely comfortable in their own skin, regardless of where they happened to be standing. Richard watched him approach the stage with the thin, patient smile of a man whose punchline is coming. Around him, the room watched too. And then, one by one, something began to happen that Richard Hamilton had not scripted and could not immediately process. A man at the third table from the stage, Thomas Keller, the founder of one of the most influential private equity firms in the Midwest, rose from his chair. He did not say anything. He simply stood. 2 seats to his left, a woman who served on the board of 3 major financial institutions stood as well. At a table near the east wall, a former deputy secretary of commerce rose quietly and clasped his hands in front of him. A technology executive whose company had gone public at a valuation of over $30 billion the previous year turned to the man beside him and said something in a low voice, and both of them stood. One of the senators was on his feet. Then 2. By the time Samuel Johnson reached the foot of the steps leading to the stage, at least 40 people in the room were standing, not applauding, just standing. The way people stand when someone walks into a room and the air changes. Richard's smile had stopped working. He was still wearing it, the way a person continues wearing an expression after the emotion behind it has vanished, but his hands had tightened on the edges of the podium, and his eyes had developed the particular sharp quality of a man doing rapid, desperate mathematics. Thomas Keller approached the microphone as Samuel reached the stage, and in the easy, unrehearsed tone of a man stating a simple fact, said, "Richard, I'm going to assume this is a pleasant surprise you've arranged. But just in case you do know who Sam Johnson is, don't you?" The room was very quiet. Richard Hamilton did not answer, because he did not know what answer to give. What followed in the next several minutes was the kind of revelation that rearranges a room. It did not come all at once. It came in pieces, the way the truth usually does when it has been buried long enough surfacing through the murmured conversations of people who could not believe what they were witnessing, through the straightening of postures and the widening of eyes, through the look on Thomas Keller's face, which was not triumphant but simply honest. Samuel Johnson, the man with the worn watch and the charcoal suit and the pickup truck with the dented bumper, was the founder and silent managing partner of Blackstone Crest Capital, a private investment fund that had operated in deliberate obscurity for 27 years and had, in that time, accumulated controlling or significant positions in a portfolio that spanned commercial banking, renewable energy infrastructure, telecommunications, and a significant slice of the technology sector. The fund's actual assets under management, for anyone who knew where to look in the right filings, represented a figure that made Hamilton Global's valuation look like a respectable but decidedly regional enterprise. Samuel had structured his involvement through a series of holding companies and blind trusts so thoroughly that even sophisticated financial journalists, who had tried over the years to identify the fund's leadership, had come away with nothing. He had chosen anonymity, the way other men choose ambition deliberately, consciously, as a reflection of what he actually valued. And then there was the other thing. The thing that made Richard's face go completely still. 19 years ago, Hamilton Global had nearly ceased to exist. There had been a liquidity crisis, a perfect storm of over-leveraged real estate positions, a tightening credit environment, and a legal dispute with a foreign partner that had frozen a significant portion of the company's operating capital for 14 months. Richard had spent 6 months that he rarely spoke about, even in private, making phone calls that went unanswered, attending meetings with bankers who looked at him with the careful sympathy of people delivering a diagnosis. He had been weeks away from a restructuring that would have stripped the company down to its most basic operating units and almost certainly ended his relevance in the industry. And then, through an intermediary whose name Richard had never been given, a private fund had extended a bridge financing arrangement that was so favorable it had bordered on the inexplicable patient capital, below market terms, no board seats demanded, no publicity. Richard had accepted it because he had had no choice. The intermediary had told him only that the fund believed in long-term value and had no interest in recognition. Richard had spent years since then with a vague, uneasy awareness that somewhere there was a benefactor whose name he did not know. He knew the name now. Samuel stood at the edge of the stage and looked at Richard Hamilton with the quiet attention of a man who has decided, after a long time of waiting, to speak plainly. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He simply said what was true, that many years ago, he had made a decision to support a company he believed had the potential to do something meaningful, and that he had never required anything in return for that decision, because he had not made it for any return. He said that he had watched, over the past 2 years, as his daughter was made to feel small in the house of the man whose company he had helped save. He said this without anger, in the same measured tone one might use to read aloud from a document. And then he said something that the room would remember for a very long time. He said that he was not disappointed in Richard Hamilton because Richard was poor. He was disappointed in him because Richard was rich enough, powerful enough, old enough to know better. He said that a man who has survived failure, who has been pulled back from the edge by someone who asked for nothing in return, ought to develop some understanding of the limits of his own judgment. He said that measuring a person's worth by the number in their bank account was not sophistication. It was laziness. It was the laziness of a man who had run out of the courage to actually look at people. And then he was quiet. He stood there in his plain suit with his old watch, and the room was absolutely silent, and in that silence was everything. The applause, when it came, was not the theatrical explosion of a crowd watching a staged victory. It was the steady, sustained sound of a large group of people who have just seen something honest happen in a room that is not usually the venue for honesty. It went on for a long time. Richard Hamilton stood at the podium and could not move. He had been a man who controlled rooms his entire life. He had negotiated across tables where the stakes were measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. He had stared down regulators and rivals and journalists and disgruntled board members and never once felt the particular quality of vulnerability that was moving through him now, the exposed, stripped clean feeling of a man who has been seen accurately. He thought of every dinner at which Maya had passed the breadbasket with a smile that had cost her something. He thought of the 4th of July table, the laughter, the question about the watch shop delivered with that bright, weaponized smile. He thought of Ethan's face across the luncheon table in March, the careful, determined face of a son who had loved his father long enough to be genuinely tired of it. He thought of the report from the investigator, which he had read twice and filed away with the satisfied nod of a man whose prejudices had been confirmed. He stood at the podium of his own 40th anniversary gala, surrounded by the most important people in his professional life, and he felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the specific weight of being wrong. He left the stage without finishing his remarks. A company spokesperson improvised a closing for the program. The orchestra resumed. The evening continued around the wreckage of Richard Hamilton's certainty, and people spoke to each other in the subdued, slightly electric register of those who have witnessed something they will be describing for years. Richard spent the remainder of the evening in a small office, adjacent to the ballroom, sitting in a leather chair that probably cost as much as a month of Samuel Johnson's shop rent, staring at nothing in particular. The city glittered outside the window. He could hear the muffled sound of the party conversation, music, the gentle percussion of crystal and silverware, and the contrast between that warmth and his own silence was more than he could quite process. He thought about money. He had thought about money for 68 years, almost every day. And for the first time, he noticed how little comfort the thought was currently providing him. He picked up his phone and called Ethan. It rang through to voicemail. He sat with the phone in his hand for several minutes. He did not leave a message because he did not yet know what to say. He called again. Voicemail again. He set the phone face down on the arm of the chair and looked at the city and understood, with the slow-moving clarity of a realization that has been building for longer than you knew, that the thing he had been defending, the hierarchy, the bloodline, the careful architecture of belonging and exclusion, had not protected him from anything. It had merely cost him the people he loved. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs specifically to the proud, the grief of a person who has held their position so long and so rigidly that losing it feels like losing themselves. Richard sat with that grief in the small office for a long time. He cried, eventually. Not dramatically, not with the heaving sobs of a man in a film, but quietly, the way old men cry when the room is empty and there is no longer any reason to perform composure. He cried because he thought about Maya passing the breadbasket. He cried because he thought about Ethan eating alone at a restaurant after leaving the negotiation that was supposed to be a lunch. He cried because Samuel Johnson had stood on his stage in a plain suit with an old watch and said the truest thing Richard had heard in 40 years, and Richard had not had the grace to say so out loud. He went home alone. He sat in the kitchen of his house, a kitchen that had been designed by an award-winning architect and featured appliances from 6 different European countries, and made himself a cup of instant coffee because it was the only kind he remembered how to make, from the days when instant was the only kind he could afford. He drank it at the kitchen island and thought about his father. His father had been a hard man, exacting and proud, a man who had communicated love through achievement and withheld it through disappointment. Richard had spent his entire adult life either running toward that model or running away from it, and he was no longer certain which he had been doing. The weeks that followed were quiet. Richard did not make public statements. He did not issue press releases. He showed up to the office and worked through his schedule and said little to anyone beyond what the work required. His assistant noticed that he was spending more time looking out the window. A board member who had lunch with him 3 weeks after the gala remarked to his wife that Richard seemed diminished in some way. Not defeated, exactly, but as though some internal pressure he had always operated under had been released, leaving him smaller but also somehow more present. He called Ethan 11 times before Ethan answered. It was a Sunday morning. Ethan was in the kitchen of the apartment he shared with Maya, making coffee. He picked up on the 12th call not because he had forgiven his father, but because he had decided that avoidance was its own kind of cowardice, and he was his father's son enough to find cowardice intolerable. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. Richard did not make speeches. He did not negotiate. He said what he had been sitting with for 3 weeks, that he had been wrong, in a way that had nothing to do with money or status or any of the frameworks he had spent his life building, and that he understood if Ethan did not know what to do with that. He said he wanted to apologize to Maya, in person, without any audience and without any agenda, if she was willing to see him. He said he wanted to meet with Samuel Johnson, for the same reason. He said he was not asking for anything in return, not forgiveness, not a restored relationship, not the comfortable resolution of his own guilt. He said he just wanted to say what was true, which was that he had treated people badly, and he knew it, and he was sorry. Ethan was quiet for a long time after his father finished. Then he said he would talk to Maya. Maya said yes. She had, in the privacy of her own heart, been waiting for this. Not with any certainty. She was not a woman who expected the world to deliver the apologies it owed her, but with the kind of patient openness that is the mark of someone who has not allowed bitterness to close them. She had talked to her father on the phone the night after the gala, and Samuel had told her only that he was glad she was all right and that Ethan was a good man. She had asked him if he felt any satisfaction in what had happened, and he had considered it honestly before saying that satisfaction was not quite the right word. He had said that he had not gone to the gala to expose Richard Hamilton. He had gone because his daughter had asked him to be there, and because there are moments when a father needs to stand in a room for no other reason than to remind his child that they are not alone. The rest of it had simply been the truth, finding its way out, the way truth tends to do when it has been kept in a small enough space for long enough. Richard drove himself to the meeting. He did not bring his assistant. He did not bring his driver. He took his own car, the same car he had always used for occasions when he wanted to feel like himself, rather than like Richard Hamilton, chairman, and drove to the address Ethan had given him, which turned out to be a small restaurant in a neighborhood Richard had never had occasion to visit, a place with paper tablecloths and a handwritten menu and a woman behind the counter who greeted every customer by name. He arrived early. He sat at a corner table and ordered coffee, and looked around at the restaurant with the careful attention of a man trying to see something he has previously been incapable of seeing. They arrived together, Ethan, Maya, and Samuel. Samuel was wearing a flannel shirt and dark trousers and the same old watch. He looked, Richard thought, exactly the way he had looked at the gala, and exactly the way he had looked at the wedding, and exactly the way he must look every single day of his life, like a man who has nothing to prove and therefore nothing to perform. Richard stood up. He looked at Maya first. He said her name, and then he said he was sorry. And he said it without preamble, and without qualification, and without the subtle, practiced lawyering that had characterized everything he had said to her for 2 years. He said he had been wrong about what mattered. He said he had confused the map for the territory, had confused his ideas about value with value itself, and that it had cost him a relationship with a daughter-in-law who deserved better than he had offered. He said he hoped she could forgive him, and he said it knowing that forgiveness was hers to give or withhold, and that either choice would be understandable. Maya looked at him for a moment. Then she said she forgave him. She said it simply, the way she did most things, without theatrical weight. She said forgiveness was not the same as forgetting, and that rebuilding something took time, but that she was willing to try, if he was. Richard nodded. He looked like a man who has just been told he is allowed to breathe again after a long time of holding it. He turned to Samuel. Samuel was watching him with a quality of attention that was not hostile and not warm, simply patient, the attention of a man who is waiting to see what the evidence shows. Richard said he had spent 3 weeks thinking about what Samuel had said at the gala, and that he had not been able to find a single word of it that was wrong. He said that the hardest part of those 3 weeks had not been the professional embarrassment, though that was real, but the recognition that he had built his sense of self on a measuring stick that had never actually measured anything worth measuring. He said that Samuel had done something for him 19 years ago that he had never adequately acknowledged, not because he hadn't tried to find the source of the funding, but because he had ultimately decided it did not matter, which was itself a kind of arrogance. He said he was grateful, and he said it the way you say something when you have stripped away all the social scaffolding and are left with just the bare truth of a feeling. Samuel was quiet for a long time. The paper tablecloth between them had a small coffee ring on it from Richard's cup. The woman behind the counter was talking quietly to a regular. Outside, a city bus went past. Samuel reached across the table and shook Richard's hand. It was a firm, unhurried handshake, the kind that carries no agenda. He said that he had not come to the gala for revenge, and that he had no interest in anyone's humiliation, including Richard's. He said that the speech he had given had been the speech of a father, not a financier, the words of a man who had watched his daughter absorb 2 years of quiet contempt and had finally been in a room where it was appropriate to say out loud what all of them already knew. He said that Richard was capable of being a better man than the one who had shown up to most of the past 2 years, and that he believed this not because the evidence was overwhelming, but because Ethan existed. And a man could not raise a son like Ethan without having something genuinely good in him somewhere. Richard looked at his son when Samuel said this. Ethan was watching his coffee cup. His jaw was working in the way it did when he was holding something together. Richard said, for the first time in his memory, that he was proud of his son, not for his academic record or his career choices or his capacity to earn or lead or perform, but for the simple fact of who he was. For the way he had sat across a luncheon table in March and chosen the right thing even though it cost him. For the way he had loved his wife in a house where that love was not respected. Ethan looked up. The expression on his face was complicated in the way that the expressions of people who have been waiting a long time for one specific thing are always complicated when that thing finally arrives. They sat at the paper tablecloth table for 3 hours. The woman behind the counter refilled their coffee 3 times without being asked. At some point, food appeared, a rotating selection of the house specials that nobody had ordered, but that arrived with the effortless timing of a place that knows when a table needs something warm. They talked about things that had nothing to do with money. Ethan's current caseload, Maya's upcoming program launch, a research project Samuel was quietly funding at a university in Detroit. Richard asked questions and listened to the answers, without immediately formulating his response, which was new for him and effortful and worth it. He told a story about his father that he had not told anyone in decades, a story about a summer he had spent working in a factory at 16 and what it had felt like to come home with blisters on his hands and the small, specific pride of having made something with his body, and how somewhere along the way he had come to think of that kind of pride as small when it was actually enormous. Samuel listened to this story with the careful attention he gave everything, and said that he thought Richard had answered his own question. He said that the tragedy of men like Richard, men who built empires on the foundation of their own early hunger, was not that they forgot where they came from, it was that they remembered it wrong. They turned it into proof of their superiority instead of a bridge to their empathy. He said that a man who has known what it feels like to be underestimated ought to be the last person in any room to underestimate someone else, and yet these men so often became the first. Then he smiled, and the smile transformed his face in a way that made Richard suddenly understand, without needing to be told, exactly what Maya had inherited from this man, and exactly why she had never needed anyone else's approval. They parted outside the restaurant in the pale October light. Maya hugged her father for a long time. Ethan shook Samuel's hand, and then, in the slightly awkward way of men who have not yet established the physical vocabulary of their affection, hugged him briefly. Samuel nodded at Richard before getting into his truck. Richard watched the truck pull into traffic and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, his hands in his pockets, the collar of his coat turned up against the wind. He had come to this neighborhood not knowing what he would find, and he was leaving with the specific, unfamiliar feeling of a man who has set something down that he did not realize he was carrying. The healing was not sudden, because real healing never is. It happened in the incremental, quiet way that things actually change when the change is genuine. A Sunday dinner that was awkward but present, a phone call that lasted longer than expected, a holiday gathering where the silences were the comfortable kind instead of the loaded kind. Richard learned to ask Maya questions about her work and to actually listen when she answered. He attended a fundraising event for her organization and wrote a check that he told no one about and asked for nothing in return. He spent an afternoon at Samuel's shop on Delaney Street, ostensibly dropping off a pocket watch that needed a new mainspring, and stayed for 4 hours because Samuel was interesting to talk to and because the shop was a quiet and honest place. And Richard had been in too few quiet, honest places in his life. Maya watched her father-in-law make these adjustments with the patient, discerning eye of a woman who knows the difference between performance and change. She saw the difference. It was in the way he talked about her, not as an extension of Ethan, not as a presence to be accommodated, but as a person with a point of view worth engaging. It was in the way he looked at her father, not with the calculation of a man assessing an asset, but with the slightly humbled attention of someone who has recently learned that their map of the world was missing a continent. There was a dinner, about 3 months after the gala, at Ethan and Maya's apartment, just the 5 of them, without the formal weight of a restaurant or the historical freight of the Hamilton estate. Maya cooked, and the meal was warm and real, and at one point during the evening, Samuel and Richard found themselves alone in the small living room, while Ethan and Maya dealt with a small kitchen emergency involving a sauce that had come too close to the edge of the pot. They sat across from each other on the sofa and the armchair, and there was a moment of silence that was not uncomfortable. The silence of 2 men who have moved past the necessity of performing anything for each other. Richard looked at Samuel's watch, the old one, with the worn leather strap, and asked about it. Samuel said it had belonged to his father, the mechanic. He said it had never kept perfect time, but that he had never felt the need to replace it. Richard said he thought that was a good philosophy. Samuel said he thought so too. The camera, if there had been one, would have pulled back slowly from the window of that apartment past the warm glow of the kitchen, where Maya was laughing about the sauce, past Ethan's hand on the small of her back, past the 2 old men and the old watch, and the quiet, hard-won truce of the living room, and out into the city, where the lights were coming on one by one in the gathering dark. What it would have found in that image, if you looked at it long enough, was not a resolution so much as a beginning, the beginning of a family, that had agreed, at significant cost and after significant failure, to try to see each other clearly, not perfectly, not without the residue of the past, but clearly. Samuel said one more thing that night, when the dishes were done and the coats were being retrieved and the evening was reaching its natural end. He said it to no one in particular, in the offhand way of a man thinking out loud while he was buttoning his coat in the hallway. He said that money was a remarkable thing, that it could build cities and fund cures and move mountains when it was deployed with intention. But he said that the thing money had never been able to do, not in all the history of people accumulating it, was teach a man how to look at another human being and see them accurately. That, he said, required something that cost nothing and was therefore the rarest thing in the world, the willingness to be wrong about who mattered and to say so out loud. He finished buttoning his coat. He kissed his daughter on the cheek. He shook Richard's hand, the same firm, unhurried handshake from the paper tablecloth restaurant, and walked out into the October air toward his truck. Richard stood in the doorway and watched him go. Ethan came to stand beside him. They watched the truck's taillights disappear around the corner, and then they stood in the doorway for another moment, father and son, neither of them speaking. The city doing what cities do in the quiet spaces between important things, continuing, indifferent and eternal, while the people in its buildings tried, in their small and stumbling ways, to figure out what they owed each other. The people who are truly great, it turns out, do not need to announce themselves. They do not need to prove their worth in ballrooms or board meetings or over white tablecloths at private clubs. They carry their worth in the way they move through rooms, not the rooms of the powerful, but the ordinary rooms, the paper tablecloth rooms, the small shops on quiet streets where watches are repaired and the work is honest, and the only currency that matters is whether you treated the person in front of you with the care they deserved. The rest of it, the buildings, the portfolios, the anniversary galas with the 800 orchid centerpieces, is just furniture. It is what you do with the quiet that tells you who you are.